You are listening to AccessUW, a podcast series brought to you by the University of Washington Office of the ADA Coordinator, where we highlight insightful discussions, informative interviews, and valuable insights about accessibility, equity, and inclusion, all within the realm of higher education with experts across the UW. In terms of accessibility, each podcast and a transcript are made available at the Office of the ADA Coordinator's website at www.washington.edu/ADA. Welcome back to AccessUW, a podcast series brought to you by the Office of the ADA Coordinator. Today, we're going to delve deeper into Section 504. As you probably already know by listening to this podcast series or checking out any of the other engagement events, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the signing of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So today I have with me Bree and Heather to kind of delve into what is the law in general and what did it provide, and also why was this a big milestone in disability rights history, and why this is still so important to celebrate today. So let's kick it off to Bree, our ADA coordinator first, whose position is actually ADA coordinator / Section 504 coordinator. So Bree, to your understanding, what is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act?
Section 504 was the first civil rights protection in the United States that prohibited discrimination against individuals with disabilities, which is fantastic in terms of history, because up until 1973, it was really more specialized programs that we were speaking to in terms of federal legislation or state legislation. So this was really the first foundational piece that put non-discrimination in place in the U.S. For individuals with disabilities. The caveat I'll mention, however, is it was only for public entities, meaning it did not cover private organizations. But that's like the federal government was focused on that, and we'll get into that a bit later. But so all public entities, higher education, K through 12, correctional, healthcare, city governments, county governments, state governments, all public entities had to ensure non-discrimination for individuals with disabilities across all their programs, services, and activities. So the University of Washington was one of those.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, 1973 hit and there was the non-discrimination against persons with disabilities. There was equal access. But if you can't see our faces, which you guys can't, we're all laughing and giggling right now because we know that isn't the truth. Because there's a lot of confusion on this year being the 50th anniversary, but it's actually the 50th anniversary of since it was signed, because it wasn't implemented until shortly thereafter. So Heather, would you mind delving in a little bit deeper into the history and why it took so long for this to be implemented on a national level?
Absolutely, Toby. There is a lot of confusion over the date on which 504 really became a law. And the Rehabilitation Act was in a lot of ways an update to earlier rehabilitation laws there was one passed in 1920. But in 1973, basically, what we saw is the dominant view of disability at that time, particularly among politicians at least, was very much this deficit perspective, right? That disability was purely a medical problem that needed to be fixed or cured. And if you're not sure what the difference is between the deficit perspective versus a diversity perspective of disability, see our podcast on that topic because we had a discussion about that. So back to the confusion about the dates. So when drafting up some updated legislation on rehabilitation services for disabled Americans, the bill at the time was really under the purview of the Federal Office of the Health, Education, and Welfare Office. And a staffer, as the story goes, slipped in this non-discrimination language, which we know today as Provision 504. And again, this section of the law it mirrored the language very closely that went into the 1964 Civil Rights Act, a law that disabled people were left out of. But that's a whole nother conversation. But when lawmakers realized what had happened, that this really broad blanket non-discrimination language about public entities was snuck in, like it caused a shitstorm. Lawmakers, schools, universities, hospitals were claiming that this providing equal access, providing accommodations to disabled people was going to bankrupt the nation. I mean, the hyperbole was kind of off the walls. Nixon, who was president at the time, vetoed the legislation. Twice, as a matter of fact, and really singling out this Section 504 as being the only real problematic part of the law.
So, how specifically did disability activists respond to this? Because as we know from a historical perspective, that the disability rights movement was really starting to build in the 60s and 70s. We saw a lot of different protests and advocating for different rights. So, how did the disability community and the disability rights movement grasp a hold of Section 504, and how did they fight for this to be implemented?
Right. Well, I mean, as you might imagine, disability rights activists were outraged. In 1972, so leading up to the final signing of the law, there were demonstrations and protests in New York, in D.C. Groups like Disabled in Action, Paralyzed Veterans of America, the National Paraplegia Foundation. And so the 1973 Rehabilitation Act was signed into law eventually. But Section 504 required an additional step. And that is when a piece of legislation, it could be signed into law, but then often you have to develop regulations on how that law is going to be implemented, how it will be enforced, etc. Right. And so that piece wasn't signed in 1973, and it required a separate signature, again, a set of regulations to be signed by the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. And so that one piece was stalled. And you may recall that President Nixon got himself nixed, you might say, from office, was replaced by Gerald Ford, who frankly also turned out to be totally useless in terms of disability rights. A new president came in, Jimmy Carter, and he also was really concerned about the cost of implementing such a provision. And he ordered that a series of studies be conducted to determine what the costs would actually be. Again, here, I just want to emphasize or amplify what Bree said. I mean, this was impacting universities, hospitals, government agencies, not generally the folks that we think of to start yelling, oh my gosh, we just can't afford to accommodate folks with disabilities. But disability rights activists, to your point, Toby, they were nonstop applying pressure, and not just in the streets. They mounted a federal lawsuit protesting the delay. Groups, like I said, Disabled in Action, of which the late, great Judy Heumann was part, and the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities, or ACCD, were absolutely key to keeping that 504 provision in place, keeping it alive as originally written. And it wasn't signed until 1977. These battles went on when Secretary Califano finally relented and signed the regulations that would allow Section 504 to be implemented.
Heather, what would you say is the tipping point in 97 or 1977 of actually allowing the Hughes secretary to actually sign this into law? What were disability rights activists doing? What were these different coalitions doing to make sure that it was actually getting implemented? Was it emailing, sending letters, or was it something that was gave more visibility?
Yeah, that is a great question, Toby. And I love how you've just revealed your generation to suggest that people were emailing folks in 1970s. Um,
The
no, I say that with absolute fondness. But yes, you're right. There was protests and engagement at all levels. And as I mentioned, there were numerous sit-ins between 1972 and 77. But you're right, there was kind of a tipping point. Probably the most famous of protests in the US, one of the most famous, took place in April of 1977 when activists demonstrated at federal Hugh Health, Education, and Welfare buildings in Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Denver, Los Angeles, New York, Philadelphia, yes, even here in Seattle. But arguably, the most successful of these sit-ins happen in San Francisco, where disabled folks, led again by Judy Heumann, Kitty Cohn, Mary Jane Owen, they occupied the regional headquarters of the Health, Education, and Welfare building. And so they took over that building on April 5th. And they remained there. They refused to leave. A contingent of folks from that group did at one point leave San Francisco and travel to DC to protest more directly without much opportunity to meet with Callahan there. They returned to San Francisco where their colleagues have been holding down the fort, so to speak. And they were threatening to take over other regional headquarters if 504 wasn't the regulations weren't signed and implemented. He finally relented on May 4th. So they occupied that building for 25 days. And there is a great story here about not just cross coalition building across disability types, but coalition building across a number of social justice groups that were involved and supported this sit-in. This included things like when communications were shut off in the building, ASL interpreters inside relayed information to those outside of the building and vice versa. So it's a great example of the kind of innovation and adaptation that disabled people are accustomed to happening in the moment in order to be like, yeah, you can turn off our phone lines. We can still chat. Thank you very much. The Black Panthers in San Francisco, they provided hot meals for the protesters inside, a meal a day for the protesters inside. And in fact, the local machinists union in San Francisco financially supported the group and helped send that delegation to DC and back. So again, there was just a lot of really social justice minded groups who got involved and supported this tipping point that really I think developed the set of rules and regulations and enforcement mechanisms for 504, because the courts certainly were left on their own and were interpreting that broad language in a variety of ways until they had the regulations implemented.
So, Heather, I'm going to jump in and throw one more name into that mix because you briefly mentioned the Black Panthers, but I think this is a significant aspect of this story. So Brad Lomax was he was participating in the sit-in in San Francisco as a person with a disability himself, but he also was a Black Panther. And you briefly touched on it, but I think for the audience just to know, and if it excites them to learn more about, like the Black Panther connection, specifically in the San Francisco sit-in, that helped, I think, make it historical and what it was and last as long and have the impact, is this connection with that cross coalition work. Do you have any more you could add to entice people to learn a bit more about that Black Panther connection?
I'll jump in here. This is
Okay.
Toby, but
Toby too.
yeah, no, what I was gonna say is, one, at the bottom of this podcast, there is going to be a bunch of different resources linked, as well as kind of delving more into the history of Section 504, as well as how instrumental the Black Panther Party was in this. Again, they were providing hot meals every single day. And these were folks with disabilities, folks who were chronically ill, folks who needed medical care and needed to have a diet on a daily basis. So there's a lot of quotes that you can find out there that Section 504 would not be as impactful or successful as it was without the Black Panthers parties. And I truly believe that. And I truly believe it was the impact of all these other cross coalitions that were coming together as well, too. Sorry that I cannot say them on the top of my head right now. But again, we have a bunch of different resources that delve into that as well, too. But I do want to start shifting a little further away from the history and kind of bring this back to Bree on the legal side of how did Section 504 inform higher education institutes? So following 1977, what happened? What was the initial response?
So, and I'll certainly admit I am not a historian, so I'll have a little disclaimer there, nor am I a lawyer. So those are my disclaimers. No legal advice, no historical in-depth knowledge. But I mean, overall institutions, well, public institutions, let me be clear. Public institutions, since this was only for those entities and not private institutions, um, choices had to be made about what to do to respond to this new law and the steps it would need to take to put it into place. So I will start with the University of Washington because I'm most familiar with that. The UW started what was then called the Handicapped Student Services Office in October of 1978. It was situated within the Student Life or Student Affairs Division at the time, had a part-time employee just to begin to understand who the students may be that need access to physical places on campus. But I'm going to pull back and recall that this is 1978. Internet did not exist. The main concerns of getting physical access addressed throughout our campus into buildings. We didn't have ramps that we do now for those who are on any of our campuses and locations. We would have elevators in every building. There are lots of things that don't that exist now that did not exist back in 1978. So that was a big focus in trying to understand where these access points are, who these students are, how to get them connected. Not every institution, even public ones, created offices. So, I mean, if people look back on maybe their alma maters or places they went, they can look back and see what their histories are. But it more certainly did it. Like I'm sure bigger schools, smaller schools may not have because it's a resource item. But it wasn't until 1990 when the ADA was passed, which is when all schools, private and public, really created official offices. So the UW, I think, is unique in this capacity, and it's something we should be proud of that we, as soon as it became a regulation, put something in place.
Thank you for that context. And to kind of close this podcast off, I just want to broaden it and leave it open for both of you to respond now of why do you think Section 504 is still so important today? And how does it continue to inform inclusion, access, equity within the realm of higher education or just in society today? I know we have had following laws and things of the like, but why do you see Section 504 being a pillar stone of disability rights?
Wow, Toby, that is such a big question. Thank you for springing that on us. Yes, I love
Anytime,
it.
anytime, Heather.
Would you like me to start, Heather, or do you want to start with that one?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, just on a personal note, so since you asked about something really broad, I'll immediately take it very micro. And on a personal note, I am part of the first generation of Americans who went through public school my entire educational career with this law in place, with the assumption, maybe not the reality always, but the assumption that disabled students had the right to go to school, to go to public school, to get an education. And what that means is, when we start to think of that timeline, so we have 1977, it's really starting to be implemented in a meaningful way. If you give us about 25 years, now we're up into the aughts, if you will, the 2000s. You have that whole generation who's in college, in higher education, getting graduate degrees, etc. And so I would say that even on the ground, like as an instructor, I have seen increasing numbers of students in my classroom, increasing numbers of my colleagues in the front of classrooms who openly and proudly identify as disabled or are comfortable accessing accommodations in order to help them do their work. And so, on a very personal level, we are just starting to reap the benefits of expanding our net and including these individuals so that we can take advantage of their creativity and their talents and their skills of resilience and innovation. So I'm actually really excited. I don't think certainly none of us, the three of us here, are going to make arguments that there isn't still a long way to go to create full access. But I do think that the longer we have this in place, the longer we have the expectation in place of creating inclusive learning environments, the more benefits we're going to reach as a society.
That was a beautiful response, Heather. Bree, do you have something to add?
I do, and I'm just gonna kind of process that because that was really awesome, Heather. One reason I love working with you. But I fully agree with what you're saying in terms of we are now only going to see the continued benefit and kind of building upon all these generations of students who have had this access. And I think what you said is really just insightful in terms of like where we're going, right? And kind of setting for like the future work in this area. What I'm going to focus on is how, because I've looked at the 504 language numerous times of recent, and it's for me has been recently tying to uh, the base of how we talk about inclusion now with disability. It's not just about discrimination anymore. We're really talking about inclusion more in our spaces of higher education. And the language in the original 504 paragraph, which was two sentences, two very long sentences, talk about exclusion from participation in or be denied benefits of. And then it goes into non-discrimination, but just excluded from participation in and be denied benefits of. For me, that's a base of talking about inclusion. If we want people to have equity of opportunities, we also want them to be included. We want them to be able to participate. We want them to have the same benefits as everybody else. So for me, this is a version of inclusion way back in 1973, right, 50 years ago, and is a space where we could use this language now, right, to talk about how this is about inclusion. It's not just about accommodations and non-discrimination. It's about inclusion and having all humans, right, disability or ability, right, have the same ability to participate and have meaningful access and have the student or employee experience, right, that we're trying to generate at the University of Washington or in other public agencies or entities. So that's a bit I've been reflecting upon of recent that I was going to add on to this.
And that is such a great point, Bree. I love thinking about it from this inclusion standpoint. And building on that, I think that an important part of this conversation is also pointing out that, we joke about they didn't have email in the 1970s, but today, a lot of the discussions around inclusion and access, we're talking about digital access. So access to digital spaces, having access to remote or online classrooms for folks. And I'm just wondering, Bree, if you wanted to talk a little bit about your engagement or your office's current work on ensuring that the University of Washington is trying to really provide full access to its digital spaces.
I'd be happy to spend a little bit of time on that, and maybe we'll have a future podcast that we could talk about that in more detail. So right now in 2023, the federal government, in celebration, at least in my personal humble opinion, in celebration of the 50th anniversary, or at least honoring the 50th anniversary of the signing of this law, there's been lots of activity in terms of updates to language on the original 504 or subsequent amendments to 504 across a few different areas, as well as the Department of Justice specifically putting out proposed regulations for web and social media technical standards. So this topic of digital accessibility environments is becoming a very robust discussion area this year and will continue into 2024 as we await final rules, not just proposed rules. So within Section 504 specifically, there is already proposed rules coming out for health and human services, which touches on healthcare. and other entities that provide health-related services. And it's one of the pieces of that is having standards that have to be met for websites, for public-facing websites, or for patients or community members who are engaging with those health services. So Heather, to your point, right, the government is like recognizing we need to have more clarity in our statement of what we are expecting public entities to meet. We're still waiting for the Department of Education version of this for education. That would be K through 12 and higher education. But I am expecting something, if not identical, very similar to that. So these are two 504 specific updates, since they both fall under those. And then the third is that Department of Justice, which is different than the Department of Education and the Department of Health and Human Services, as I mentioned in 504. The Department of Justice is broadly saying public entities across the US will need to meet this baseline for our website accessibility. And for those that this might be new information, well, certainly have more links for that. But the concept for you all is we've had a version of this in our built environment. There's rules of how we have to build buildings to make them safe, secure, have good, heating and cooling and water running. So there's standards of how we build buildings. This is basically a standard of how we create our digital environment at a baseline to ensure access. So this is going to be a really robust conversation. And the UW leadership that I've been able to work with so far this year, they're all in working on access and trying to determine where can we make initial adjustments to meet a new rule, while also understand that this is just the baseline. There will be areas that we institutionally want to go beyond the baseline, but we need to assess how far it'll take to get there. What the resources are for that. We don't just have extra money that we can just throw in this. Like, we have to be strategic and thoughtful and balance a variety of needs. But there is a conversation occurring about how can we meet the base standards that are going to be put out, and then also continue down fostering inclusion in all of our spaces over time. That's a long answer to your question, but there is some more robust discussion happening, and we're really going to wait to see what the federal government within the two out there and the one still coming, how that will inform any future roadmap we have to meet, and then we can choose to go beyond.
Yeah, this hearing you talk about this, Bree, it reminds me of what I think of as your mantra that you say so frequently, which is access is a journey, not a destination. In part because we don't always get it right, and in part because, our things like our digital spaces are always changing, and we have to make sure that we are meeting the challenge of creating access. And I also just want to remind our listeners that, when we're talking about accessibility, when we're talking about whether it's that baseline, the legal kind of requirements, or moving beyond that and moving towards genuine inclusion, that as this group has talked about before, that it's not just the responsibility of one office or one group to guarantee and implement access. And I wanted to highlight that on our webpage for the 504 campaign, just a reminder that we have resources listed there. And among the UW specific resources, I really want to highlight the student group, the ASUW, thank you very much, ASUW Office of Inclusive Design. So if our listeners are wondering, wow, I want to have an event, or we're meeting as a group, but I'm not even sure where to start on making sure that participants have full access, these are the folks to reach out to. They have materials and crib sheets and are available to walk folks through the things that they can do to make sure that student events or events on campus can be more inclusive.
And I'll add on to that, since that is a Seattle-specific office. For those who aren't on the Seattle campus, other locations across the UW enterprise, there is information available on the accessibility webpage broadly, the UW. So uw.edu/accessibility for other tips and resources to connect to. But yeah, if you are on the Seattle office and have a student focused event, that office is a great place to start.
And luckily for anyone tuning at home, these are all going to be linked below the podcast, so you do not need to go look them up yourselves. But I just want to say a big thank you to Bree and Heather for joining us today. I think this was a really interesting conversation of not only delving into the history of Section 504, but how it's informing university and societal policy today. And also, even though, as Bree said, it's only two long sentences, but it's still being applicable, especially in the realm of inclusion, the realm of digital accessibility. So I really appreciate your guys' insights and perspectives on this. But yeah, I think this is our podcast for today, and we're excited to bring in guests in our future episodes and continue these really important topics. So again, just thank you, Bree and Heather.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Thanks, Toby, for good moderation today.
I try my best, and we will see you guys next time.
Sounds good. Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Bye.